The chandelier above cast fractured light across polished mahogany, and somewhere between the third glass of champagne and Garrett's too loud laughter, I realized they thought they'd already won. My brother stood near the marble fireplace, one hand in his pocket, the other gesturing broadly as he spoke to Celeste about quarterly projections. My sister sat with her legs crossed, that practiced smile she'd perfected at Cotillion stretched across her face. Victoria, my mother, had positioned herself in the high-backed chair nearest to Ashford Green, our family lawyer, as if proximity to authority might somehow amplify her claim to whatever was about to be read. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Philip, my father, checked his watch for the fourth time in 10 minutes. None of them looked at me. Not once. Not when I walked in 20 minutes earlier, not when I took the seat furthest from the center of the room, tucked beside the bookshelf that held first editions no one had ever opened. I had become exceptional at being invisible in a room full of people who shared my blood. The library smelled of leather and old tobacco, a scent that clung to the Bennett estate like memory itself. Outside, the late September heat pressed against the windows, but inside, the air conditioning hummed with mechanical indifference. I wore a simple linen dress, cream-colored, nothing that would draw attention. Around my neck hung a small pendant, a piece of sea glass I'd found on Tybeck Island years ago, back when Lionel used to take me on what he called thinking walks. No one noticed it either. Ashford cleared his throat, a sound that carried the weight of ritual. He was a man in his late 60s, silver hair combed back with precision, wire-rimmed glasses that caught the light when he tilted his head. He'd been Lionel's attorney for over 30 years, had probably seen more family drama than any therapist in Savannah. He opened the leather portfolio in front of him with the kind of care reserved for sacred texts. "We are gathered today," he began, his voice measured and formal, "to execute the last will and testament of Lionel Edward Bennett, a man who built much and observed even more." There was something in the way he said observed that made my spine straighten slightly. Garrett shifted his weight, already impatient. Celeste uncrossed and recrossed her legs. Victoria's expression remained placid, but her fingers drummed once against the arm of her chair. "To my beloved daughter Victoria," Ashford continued, "I leave the collection of estate jewelry, including the sapphire set acquired in 1987, and the contents of the safe deposit box at Coastal Trust, box number 472. Victoria nodded, as if she'd been expecting exactly this. Of course she had. "To my son-in-law Philip, I bequeath the vintage automobile collection, currently housed at the estate garage, including the 1967 Shelby Cobra and the 1952 Mercedes 300 SL. Philip's expression didn't change, but I saw the slight uptick at the corner of his mouth. "To my grandson Garrett," Ashford's voice carried through the room, "I leave the Hilton Head Beach property, fully furnished, and the investment portfolio managed by Whitmore and Associates, currently valued at approximately $8.2 million. Garrett actually smiled. Actually let his teeth show. He glanced at Celeste, something passing between them that looked like validation. "To my granddaughter Celeste, the penthouse apartment in Manhattan, including all furnishings and the art collection therein, and the trust fund established in 1998, now matured." Celeste's smile widened. She touched the pearl necklace at her throat, a gesture I recognized from childhood. It was what she did when she felt she'd won something. I sat completely still. My hands rested in my lap, fingers interlaced. I had learned a long time ago that stillness was a kind of power when you had nothing else. Ashford paused. He removed his glasses, cleaned them with a small cloth he pulled from his pocket, then placed them back on his nose. The pause stretched longer than it should have. "And now," he said, "regarding the primary asset of the estate, the Bennett and Associates commercial real estate firm, including all holdings, contracts, properties, and the controlling interest in said company, currently valued at $480 million. The room went silent in a way that felt like a held breath. As well as the Bennett estate itself, this property, the vineyard in Napa Valley, and all remaining liquid assets. Victoria sat forward. Garrett's smile faltered, then returned more forced. Celeste stopped touching her necklace. "These assets," Ashford continued, his eyes scanning the room and landing, for just a moment, on me, are to be transferred in full to Miss Nora Catherine Bennett. The silence broke like glass. Celeste laughed. Actually laughed, a sharp sound that cut through the air. That's a mistake, she said, her voice pitched high with disbelief. Garrett turned toward Ashford, his face reddening. What? That doesn't make sense. Check the document again. Victoria stood. Her chair scraped against the hardwood. Ashford, there's clearly been an error. Nora hasn't been part of this family's business in nearly a decade. She doesn't even live in Savannah. Philip didn't stand, but his jaw tightened. He looked at me for the first time since I'd arrived, his gaze cold and evaluating, as if trying to determine what trick I'd pulled, what manipulation I'd managed. I didn't move. I didn't speak. My heart hammered against my ribs, but outwardly, I remained as still as the portrait of Lionel that hung above the fireplace, watching all of us with painted eyes. Ashford raised one hand, a small gesture, but it carried authority. There is no error. Lionel revised his will 14 months ago. It was reviewed by 3 separate legal teams and notarized in the presence of witnesses. This is his final and binding directive. Garrett's voice rose. This is insane. She walked away from this family. She chose some hippie town in the mountains over everything we built. You can't just give her $500 million because you feel guilty she got her feelings hurt. Celeste stood now too, joining the chorus. Grandfather was old. He wasn't thinking clearly. This is exactly the kind of thing that gets contested. We have grounds. We have every right to challenge this. Ashford's expression didn't change. You may certainly pursue legal action if you believe you have cause. However, I would advise you to hear the remainder of the instructions before making any decisions. Victoria turned sharply toward him. What remainder? There was a video message, Ashford said, recorded by Lionel 4 months before his passing. He requested it be played immediately following the reading of the will. The screen mounted on the wall flickered to life, and there he was. Lionel Edward Bennett. 83 years old at the time of recording, but his eyes were still sharp, still that pale blue that seemed to see through pretense. He sat in the study upstairs, the same room where he used to help me with my homework when I was young, back when I still thought belonging to this family was something I could earn. If you're watching this, Lionel began, his voice steady, then you've just learned something that has likely upset you. Good. Discomfort is the first step toward honesty. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. For the last 20 years, I have watched this family mistake wealth for worth. I have watched you, Victoria, treat kindness as weakness and compassion as naivety. I have watched you, Philip, build profit margins while dismantling integrity. Victoria's face flushed. Philip's hands curled into fists. Garrett, Lionel continued, you settled that harassment claim 3 years ago not because you were innocent, but because you could afford silence. Celeste, you forced Andrea Whitman out of the foundation board after she questioned your expense reports. You didn't deny the discrepancies. You simply made her disappear. Celeste's mouth opened then closed. Her face had gone pale. And Nora? Lionel's expression. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Softened, just slightly. She left because you made it clear there was no room for her, unless she became someone she wasn't. She chose dignity over inheritance. That is precisely why she has earned it now. The screen went dark. No one spoke. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that comes after an explosion, when the ringing in your ears hasn't stopped yet, and you're still processing what just happened. Then Garrett laughed. It was bitter, sharp-edged. We won, he said, looking at Celeste. Did you hear that? He just admitted she left. She abandoned the family. No judge is going to uphold this. Celeste nodded, her confidence returning. He was clearly manipulated. Nora must have visited him, fed him some sob story. This is elder abuse. Victoria turned toward me, and for the first time in 8 years, she spoke directly to me. You should be ashamed. I didn't respond. Philip stood now, buttoning his jacket. We'll contest this. All of it. Ashford, prepare for litigation. Ashford set down his pen. Before you proceed, there's one more thing. He reached into the portfolio and withdrew a smaller envelope, cream-colored, sealed with red wax. Lionel left a separate letter. It contains what he referred to as the hidden clause. Ashford broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The paper looked old, expensive, the kind of stationery Lionel used for important correspondence. He read aloud. To my family, if you are hearing this clause, it means you have already threatened litigation. I expected as much. Therefore, I have structured the inheritance with the following condition. Should any member of the Bennett family contest this will or pursue legal action against Nora's inheritance, their individual bequests will be immediately revoked and transferred in full to the Coastal Veterans Rehabilitation Center in Asheville, North Carolina, where Nora has volunteered for the past 6 years. Additionally, any party involved in the contest will be permanently removed from all Bennett family trusts, foundations, and future estates. The room went so quiet I could hear the old clock on the mantel ticking. Furthermore, Ashford continued, Lionel established a separate legal team whose sole purpose is to defend this will. They are paid from a fund he set aside specifically for this purpose. The fund contains $12 million. In short, any legal battle will be lengthy, expensive, and according to Lionel's own words here, unwinnable. Garrett's face had gone from red to white. Celeste sat down slowly, her hand gripping the arm of the chair. Victoria stared at the letter as if it might catch fire. Philip said nothing, but a muscle in his jaw twitched. Ashford folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Lionel was many things, but impulsive was not one of them. He spent over a year planning this. He knew exactly what he was doing and why. I finally spoke. My voice came out quieter than I intended, but it carried. I didn't ask for this. Every head turned toward me. I didn't visit him in secret. I didn't manipulate him. I didn't even know this was coming. Celeste's eyes narrowed. Then why did he do it? Because I said, meeting her gaze, he was paying attention. I had been 12 years old the first time I realized I didn't fit. It was the summer before 7th grade, and the family had gathered at the estate for the annual Bennett Foundation Gala. Celeste, 3 years older, had been given a custom gown, pale pink with embroidered flowers. Garrett, 2 years older, wore a tailored suit and cufflinks shaped like the family crest. I had been handed a dress from a catalog, nothing special, and told to make sure I didn't spill anything on it. The gala was held in the garden, white tents strung with lights, tables dressed in linen. I had spent weeks working on a painting for the silent auction, a watercolor of the estate at sunrise. I'd been so proud of it, had imagined someone bidding, had imagined my family seeing it hanging somewhere important. When I arrived at the tent, I found my painting tucked in the back corner, near the restrooms, unframed. Celeste's photography series was displayed at the entrance, professionally mounted, with a placard that listed her achievements. I asked my mother why mine wasn't framed. She glanced at it, then at me. Darling, it's lovely for a hobby. But let's not confuse enthusiasm with talent. That night, I found my painting in the trash. Someone had spilled wine on the corner, and rather than clean it, they'd simply thrown it away. I didn't cry. I took it out, brought it back to my room, and pinned it to the wall. I stared at it for a long time, trying to see what they saw, trying to understand why my effort wasn't worth the same care. Lionel found me there an hour later. He knocked once, then entered, his step slow and deliberate. He looked at the painting on the wall, then at me. They don't see it, he said quietly. But that doesn't mean it isn't there. I didn't understand what he meant at the time. He sat down on the edge of my bed, hands folded. Nora, some people measure worth by applause. They need an audience to tell them they matter. You're not like that. You make things because they need to exist. That's rarer than you know. I was 12. I didn't have words for what I felt, but something inside me shifted. From that night forward, I stopped trying to earn their approval. I made my art smaller, quieter. I tucked myself into corners of the estate where no one thought to look. And Lionel watched. When I was 16, I told my parents I wanted to study art therapy. I'd read about it in a magazine, how art could help people process trauma, how creativity could be healing. I thought maybe, if I could explain it right, they'd understand. Victoria listened while filing her nails. That's a nice thought, sweetheart, but let's be realistic. You'll need a real career. Philip didn't even look up from his newspaper. Bennett women don't become therapists. They host fundraisers for them. Garrett, home from his first year at Duke, laughed. You want to finger paint with crazy people? That's your big life plan? Celeste, ever the diplomat, smiled. You've always been so sensitive, Nora. Maybe something in event planning? You'd be good at that. I applied to the program anyway. I got in with a partial scholarship. When I told them, Victoria sighed. If you insist on this, don't expect us to fund your little experiment. You'll need to figure it out yourself. I did. I worked 2 jobs, took out loans, lived in a basement apartment with 3 roommates. I didn't ask them for anything. And I didn't come home for Thanksgiving that year. Lionel called me on Christmas Eve. I was alone in the apartment, my roommates all gone for the holidays. The call came at 9 p.m. Nora, he said, I'm sorry I missed you at Thanksgiving. I heard you were busy. I wasn't busy, I said. I wasn't invited. There was a long pause. Then he said, I'm inviting you now. I flew home the next day. He picked me up from the airport himself, didn't send a driver. We didn't go to the estate. We went to a diner off Highway 17, the kind of place with vinyl booths and waitresses who called you honey. We ate eggs and bacon at 10 p.m. on Christmas, and he asked me about my classes, about my art, about the people I was learning to help. He didn't ask why I wasn't at the house. He already knew. When he dropped me off at a hotel he'd booked for me, not the estate, he handed me an envelope. Inside was a check for $10,000 and a note. For your education. Not theirs. I cried in the hotel room that night, not because of the money, but because someone had finally seen me. After graduation, I moved to Asheville. It wasn't a deliberate rejection of Savannah. It was just the place that felt like I could breathe. I took a job at the Coastal Veterans Rehabilitation Center, working with veterans who were processing trauma, addiction, grief. I taught art therapy classes 3 times a week, and I volunteered on weekends. I made enough to live on, nothing extravagant. I rented a small bungalow on the edge of town with a porch where I could paint in the mornings before work. I dated occasionally, nothing serious. I had friends, real ones, who didn't care about my last name or where I came from. I built a life that was mine. I didn't tell my family where I was. They didn't ask. 2 years passed before Victoria called. It was brief. We're updating the family directory. What's your current address? I gave her the Asheville address. She paused. North Carolina? Why on earth are you there? Because I wanted to be, I said. She hung up shortly after. Lionel, though, kept in touch. Every few months, a letter would arrive. Never anything dramatic. Just updates, thoughts, the occasional clipping from a newspaper. Once, he sent me an article about art therapy being used in military hospitals. Thought you'd want to see this, he wrote in the margin. You were ahead of the curve. Another time, he sent a photograph of the estate garden in bloom. Your mother hired a new landscaper. It doesn't look the same. I think he misses your eye. I saved every letter. I kept them in a wooden box I'd made in a woodworking class. Each one folded carefully, stored in order. I never told him how much they meant. I assumed he knew. 3 years ago he visited Asheville. He didn't tell me he was coming. I got a call from the center's front desk. There's a Lionel Bennett here to see you. I walked out to the lobby, and there he was, standing in his wool coat, slightly out of place among the veterans in sweatpants and the staff in scrubs. He smiled. Show me what you've built. I gave him a tour. I showed him the art room, the ceramic studio, the gallery wall where we displayed the veterans' work. I introduced him to some of the people I worked with. James, who painted landscapes to manage his PTSD. Teresa, who made sculptures out of recycled materials. Marcus, who'd started writing poetry after 40 years of silence. Lionel listened to every story. He asked questions, thoughtful ones. He didn't rush. When we finished, he bought us lunch at a cafe downtown. Over sandwiches, he said, "You've done something important here." I shrugged. "It's just a job." "No," he said firmly. "It's a life. There's a difference." He pulled out a checkbook. "I'm making a donation to the center. $50,000. I started to protest, but he held up a hand. "This isn't charity, Nora. This is investment. You're doing the work that matters. Someone should support it." The check arrived the following week. The center used it to expand the art therapy program, hire another staff member, buy new equipment. They put a small plaque in the hallway, in honor of Lionel Bennett, supporter of healing through creativity. He never mentioned it again. I hadn't planned to attend Lionel's funeral. When the call came from Ashford Green, informing me of his passing, I felt the ground shift beneath me in a way I wasn't prepared for. He'd died in his sleep, peacefully at the estate. No suffering, Ashford had said, as if that made the absence easier to bear. The funeral was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. Services at St. Michael's Episcopal, the same church where 4 generations of Bennetts had been baptized, married, and mourned. I booked a train ticket, then canceled it. Booked it again. I sat on my porch for 2 hours the night before, watching the mountains fade into darkness, trying to decide if I could walk back into that world, even for a day. In the end I went. Not for them, but for him. I wore a black dress I'd borrowed from my friend Rachel, simple and unremarkable. I left my hair down, no jewelry except the sea glass pendant. I took the early train, arrived in Savannah by 10, and walked the 12 blocks from the station to the church rather than call a car. The heat was oppressive even in late September, the kind of humid weight that made breathing feel like work. By the time I reached St. Michael's, my dress clung to my back and my face was flushed. The church stood white and imposing against the oak trees, its steeple pointing toward a sky that threatened rain but never delivered. People were already gathering, a sea of black and dark gray, clusters of conversation on the steps. I recognized some faces. Business associates, distant cousins, family friends who'd known Lionel for decades. No one recognized me. I slipped inside and found a seat in the back, third pew from the rear, near the aisle. The church smelled of lilies and old wood, polished brass and the faint residue of incense. The Bennett family sat in the front row, of course. I could see the backs of their heads. Victoria's hair was pinned in an elegant twist. Philip sat rigid, shoulders back. Garrett and Celeste flanked them, both dressed impeccably, both staring straight ahead. The service was everything you'd expect. A rector who spoke about Lionel's contributions to the community, his business acumen, his dedication to family legacy. There was a hymn, something traditional that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. A eulogy delivered by Philip, words carefully chosen to sound heartfelt without actually revealing anything true. He built an empire, Philip said, his voice carrying through the church. He set a standard we will all strive to uphold. Garrett read a passage from Ecclesiastes. To everything there is a season. Celeste placed a single white rose on the casket, her face composed, her movements practiced. No one mentioned the Art Therapy Center. No one mentioned Asheville. No one mentioned the quiet ways Lionel had moved through the world, when cameras weren't watching. I sat through it all, hands folded in my lap, and felt the specific loneliness that comes from mourning someone no one else seemed to really know. After the service, there was a reception at the estate. I almost didn't go. I stood on the church steps, watching people file toward their cars, and considered just walking back to the station. But something pulled me forward. Maybe it was the need to see the house one more time. Maybe it was the stubborn part of me that refused to be erased, even in grief. I arrived late, after most of the guests had already settled into the rhythm of polite conversation and passed hors d'oeuvres. The estate looked the same as it always had. Grand columns, wraparound porch, gardens meticulously maintained. Spanish moss hung from the oak trees like something out of a postcard. Inside, the air was cooler, filled with the low murmur of voices and the clink of glassware. I moved through the room slowly, careful to stay on the periphery. I watched Celeste hold court near the fireplace, accepting condolences with grace, her hand occasionally touching the arms of those who spoke to her. I watched Garrett shake hands with men in expensive suits, already talking business, already moving past grief into strategy. Victoria stood near the dining room, directing staff with subtle gestures, making sure everything appeared seamless. I was invisible again, just as I'd always been. I found myself drawn to the library, the room where we'd later gather for the will reading, though I didn't know that yet. It was quieter there, only a few guests browsing the shelves or sitting in the leather chairs with drinks in hand. I stood in front of the portrait of Lionel, the one that hung above the fireplace. It had been painted when he was 60, still vital, still sharp-eyed. The artist had captured something in his expression, a kind of knowing amusement, as if he were perpetually aware of a joke no one else had caught yet. "I miss you," I whispered, too quiet for anyone else to hear. A voice behind me said, "He spoke about you often." I turned. It was Ashford Green, holding a glass of bourbon, his expression neutral but not unkind. I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded. "He was very proud of the work you do," Ashford continued. He kept a folder in his office. Articles about the center, photographs from events. He showed it to me more than once. My throat tightened. "I didn't know that." "Most people didn't," Ashford said. "Lionel wasn't sentimental in the way people expected. But he was deliberate. Everything he did had intention." He took a sip of his drink. "You should stay for the will reading. It's scheduled for next week, but I think it would be meaningful for you to be present." I hesitated. "I'm not sure I'm welcome." Ashford's expression didn't change. "You were requested specifically. By Lionel." That was when I should have known. That was when I should have realized something had shifted. But grief has a way of clouding intuition, and I was too tired to read between lines. The week between the funeral and the will reading passed in a strange suspension. I returned to Asheville, went back to work, moved through my routines with the mechanical efficiency of someone trying not to think too hard. I taught my classes, led a group session on using color to express emotion, met with Teresa about her upcoming gallery showing. But at night, alone in my bungalow, I'd sit on the porch and think about that folder Ashford had mentioned. The idea that Lionel had kept track of my life, had documented it in some quiet way, felt both comforting and unbearably sad. I wondered what else he'd kept. What else he'd seen that I didn't know he was watching. The letter from Ashford arrived on a Wednesday, the formal invitation to the will reading. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. The heavyweight paper, the embossed Bennett crest, my name written in careful script. I almost didn't go. I called Rachel, talked it through over coffee at her kitchen table. "What's the worst that could happen?" she asked. "They ignore you," she continued, answering her own question. "They've been doing that for years. You're used to it." "But what if it's worse?" I said. "What if they make it clear I was never really part of it?" Rachel reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Then you come back here, and you keep building the life you've already built. The one that's real." I went. I packed a small bag, took the train again, arrived in Savannah the evening before the reading. I stayed at a hotel downtown, not the estate, couldn't stomach the idea of sleeping under that roof. I walked through the historic district as the sun set, past the squares with their fountains and monuments, past the rows of townhouses with their shuttered windows and iron gates. Savannah had always felt like a city stuck in amber, beautiful and preserved and somehow lifeless. The next day, I dressed carefully. The linen dress, the sea glass pendant. I braided my hair, then undid it, left it loose. I looked at myself in the hotel mirror, and barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked calm. She looked composed. She looked like someone who didn't need anything from anyone. I hoped that was true. When I arrived at the estate, the family was already gathering. I walked through the front door, past the foyer with its chandelier and marble floor, and made my way to the library. No one greeted me. No one acknowledged my presence. Garrett was on his phone, pacing near the window. Celeste was adjusting her hair in the reflection of a framed painting. Victoria and Philip were speaking in low voices near the bookshelves, their conversation too quiet to overhear. I took the seat by the bookshelf, the one furthest from the center. I set my small purse on the floor beside me, and folded my hands in my lap. I became the smallest version of myself, the one I'd perfected over years of practice. Ashford arrived precisely at 2. He carried the leather portfolio, set it on the table with care, and took his seat at the head. The room settled into an expectant quiet. I could feel the tension, the way everyone was leaning slightly forward, ready to hear what they believed they already knew. This was a formality to them, a ritual. They'd already divided the estate in their minds, already planned what they'd do with their portions. That's when I noticed it, the way Garrett and Celeste kept glancing at each other. Small looks, quick and conspiratorial. The way Victoria's fingers drummed against her chair, not nervous but eager. They thought they knew how this would go. They thought they'd already won. Ashford began the reading and for the first several minutes, Everything unfolded exactly as they expected. The jewelry to Victoria. The cars to Philip. The beach house to Garrett, who actually smiled when he heard it. The penthouse to Celeste, who touched her pearls in that familiar gesture of satisfaction. I watched them collect their prizes, watched the way their faces relaxed into something like vindication. And then Ashford said my name. Regarding the primary asset of the estate, the Bennett & Associates commercial real estate firm, including all holdings, contracts, properties, and the controlling interest in said company, currently valued at $480 million. As well as the Bennett estate itself, this property, the vineyard in Napa Valley, and all remaining liquid assets. These assets are to be transferred in full to Miss Nora Catherine Bennett. The room exploded. Not immediately, but in a cascade. First the sharp intake of breath from Celeste, then the scrape of Garrett's chair as he stood, then Victoria's wine glass hitting the floor with a sound like a gunshot. Philip's face turned to stone. Celeste actually laughed, that disbelieving sound that wasn't humor but shock trying to find an outlet. That's a mistake, she said, her voice high and tight. Check the document again. Garrett's face had gone red, his hands clenched. What the hell is this? This doesn't make any sense. Victoria stood, her composure cracking. Ashford, there's clearly been an error. Nora hasn't been part of this family's business in nearly a decade. She doesn't even live in Savannah. I stayed seated. I didn't speak. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, but I kept my face neutral, kept my hands still. I had learned this a long time ago. How to disappear even when you were visible. How to become a witness to your own life rather than a participant. Ashford raised his hand, that small gesture of authority. There is no error. Lionel revised his will 14 months ago. It was reviewed by 3 separate legal teams and notarized in the presence of witnesses. This is his final and binding directive. Garrett's voice rose, anger spilling over. This is insane. She walked away from this family. She chose some hippie town in the mountains over everything we built. You can't just give her $500 million because you feel guilty she got her feelings hurt. Celeste joined in, her voice sharp. Grandfather was old. He wasn't thinking clearly. This is exactly the kind of thing that gets contested. We have grounds. We have every right to challenge this. Philip finally spoke, his voice cold and measured. We'll be pursuing legal action. This will not stand. Victoria turned to me, her eyes hard. You should be ashamed. That was when Garrett said it. He looked at Celeste, then at his parents, and smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. We won, he said. Did you hear that? He just admitted she left. She abandoned the family. No judge is going to uphold this. Celeste nodded, her confidence returning like a tide. He was clearly manipulated. Nora must have visited him, fed him some sob story. This is elder abuse. They were talking about me as if I weren't there. As if I were still that 12-year-old girl with the painting in the trash, powerless and easy to dismiss. But I wasn't 12 anymore. I'd spent 8 years building something real, something mine. I'd learned how to hold my ground, even when the ground was shaking. Ashford's voice cut through the rising noise. Before you proceed, there's one more thing. He reached into the portfolio and withdrew a smaller envelope, sealed with red wax. The room went quiet again, the kind of quiet that comes when people realize they might have miscalculated. Lionel left a separate letter, Ashford said. It contains what he referred to as the hidden clause. He broke the seal with deliberate slowness, unfolded the paper, and began to read. To my family, if you are hearing this clause, it means you have already threatened litigation. I expected as much. The words hung in the air like smoke. Therefore, I have structured the inheritance with the following condition. Should any member of the Bennett family contest this will or pursue legal action against Nora's inheritance, their individual bequests will be immediately revoked and transferred in full to the Coastal Veterans Rehabilitation Center in Asheville, North Carolina, where Nora has volunteered for the past 6 years. The color drained from Celeste's face. Garrett's mouth opened, then closed. Victoria sat down heavily. Additionally, Ashford continued, any party involved in the contest will be permanently removed from all Bennett family trusts, foundations, and future estates. Furthermore, Lionel established a separate legal team whose sole purpose is to defend this will. They are paid from a fund he set aside specifically for this purpose. The fund contains $12 million. Ashford looked up from the letter. In short, any legal battle will be lengthy, expensive, and according to Lionel's own words here, unwinnable. The silence was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. I watched them process it. Watched the realization settle over them like ash. They hadn't won. They'd lost before they'd even begun. Ashford folded the letter and placed it back on the table. Lionel was many things, but impulsive was not one of them. He spent over a year planning this. He knew exactly what he was doing and why. I finally spoke. My voice was quieter than I intended, but it carried through the room. I didn't ask for this. Every head turned toward me. I didn't visit him in secret. I didn't manipulate him. I didn't even know this was coming. Celeste's eyes narrowed, something like hatred flickering there. Then why did he do it? I met her gaze and held it. Because he was paying attention. The words landed with more weight than I expected. Victoria flinched. Philip looked away. Garrett's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Because while you were busy performing, I said, my voice steadier now, I was living. While you were collecting things, I was building something that mattered. He saw that. Even if you couldn't. Ashford cleared his throat. If there are no further questions about the will itself, we can schedule individual meetings to discuss the transfer of assets. I suggest everyone take some time to process before making any decisions. No one responded. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker. One by one they stood and left. Celeste first, her heels sharp against the hardwood. Garrett followed, phone already in his hand. Philip and Victoria moved together, their silence heavy with things unsaid. None of them looked at me as they passed. I stayed seated, my hands still folded in my lap, until the room was empty except for Ashford. He gathered his papers slowly, methodically. When he finally looked at me, his expression was unreadable. He believed in you, Ashford said. More than you know. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, but refused to let them fall. I don't know if I can do this. You don't have to decide today, he said. But Lionel wouldn't have left this to you if he didn't think you were capable. He stood, picked up his portfolio. There's one more thing. He left something for you in his study. Personal items. You're welcome to collect them whenever you're ready. After he left, I sat alone in the library for a long time. The portrait of Lionel watched me from above the fireplace, that knowing expression still present. Still seeing something I couldn't quite grasp. I thought about the last time I'd seen him. That visit to Asheville 3 years ago. The way he'd listened to the veteran stories, the way he'd asked real questions, the way he'd looked at me afterward and said, "You've done something important here." I hadn't understood it as goodbye. Maybe he hadn't either. Or maybe he'd known all along that this was how it would end, with me sitting in this room, holding the weight of everything he'd built, wondering if I was strong enough to carry it. Outside, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the library windows. I could hear the distant sound of cicadas, that southern summer song that never really ends. I stood slowly, picked up my purse, and walked out of the library. I didn't go to his study. Not yet. I wasn't ready to face whatever he'd left behind, wasn't ready to see the evidence of his attention, his care, his belief in me. Instead, I walked through the estate room by room, seeing it differently now. Not as the place that had rejected me, but as the thing I'd inherited. The responsibility, the burden, the gift. I left the estate that evening without saying goodbye to anyone. There was no one to say goodbye to anyway. The family had scattered like birds after a gunshot, each retreating to their own corners to nurse their wounds and plot their next moves. I drove back to the hotel in a rental car I'd picked up that morning, the streets of Savannah blurring past in shades of amber and shadow. The live oaks formed tunnels over the roads, their branches twisted and ancient, and I felt like I was driving through a memory rather than a city. Back in my hotel room, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my phone. 23 missed calls. 14 text messages. I scrolled through them with a kind of detached curiosity, the way you might examine something under glass at a museum. 3 calls from Celeste. 2 voicemails. The first was brief, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Nora, we need to talk. This isn't over. Call me back." The second was longer, softer, the tone shifting to something that might have passed for concern if you didn't know better. I've been thinking about everything that happened today. I know this must be overwhelming for you. Grandfather clearly wanted to make a statement, but you have to understand, this kind of responsibility, it's not something you just step into. There are complexities you don't understand. Legal structures, business relationships. I'm not trying to be condescending. I'm trying to help. We're still family, Nora. Let's talk this through before you make any decisions you'll regret. I deleted both voicemails without listening to them a second time. Garrett had sent a series of text messages, each one escalating in frustration. This is insane. You know that, right? Call me. We need to figure out how to fix this. Dad's talking to lawyers. You should probably get your own. I'm not trying to be a dick, but you're in over your head here. There were 2 more, sent within minutes of each other. Fine. Don't respond. But when this blows up, don't say we didn't try to help you. The last one simply said, "You've changed." And not in a good way. I almost laughed at that. Changed. As if staying the same had ever been an option. As if the version of myself they'd known, the one who shrank and apologized and tried so hard to fit into spaces that were never meant for her, had been anything other than survival. Victoria had called once. No voicemail. Just the missed call sitting there like an accusation. Philip hadn't reached out at all, which somehow felt more honest than the rest. He'd never pretended to care. Why start now? I turned my phone face down on the nightstand and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The room was generic in the way hotel rooms always are, designed to be inoffensive and forgettable. Beige walls, abstract art that meant nothing, heavy curtains blocking out the Savannah night. I should have felt something. Triumph maybe, or vindication. Fear certainly. The weight of $480 million and a legacy I never asked for. But what I felt instead was a deep, exhausting emptiness. Like I'd been holding my breath for so long that now, finally allowed to exhale, I'd forgotten how. I thought about calling Rachel, but it was late, and I didn't have the energy to explain. I thought about calling the center, checking in, making sure everything was running smoothly without me. But that felt like avoidance, like trying to slip back into the life I'd built before this bomb had detonated in the middle of it. Instead, I pulled out my laptop and did what I always did when the world felt too large. I researched. I spent 3 hours reading about Bennett and Associates, pulling up articles, financial reports, profiles of the company's history. Lionel had built it from almost nothing, starting in his 30s with a single commercial property in Charleston, and expanding steadily over 5 decades. The company specialized in mixed-use developments, urban revitalization projects, sustainable building initiatives. It had a reputation for quality, for integrity, for doing things the right way even when the fast way was more profitable. There were profiles of Lionel from various points in his career. A piece from the early 90s in Southern Business Journal, talking about his philosophy of development. We're not just building structures, he'd said. We're building communities. If a project doesn't serve the people who live there, it's just vanity. Another article from 10 years ago, when the company had been recognized for its green building practices. Profit and principle aren't enemies, Lionel had told the reporter. The best businesses do well by doing good. It's not complicated. It's just rare. I read testimonials from employees, from city planners, from community organizers who'd worked with Bennett and Associates on affordable housing projects. Over and over, the same themes emerged. Fair dealing. Long-term thinking. A willingness to take less profit if it meant better outcomes for the people affected. This was what I'd inherited. Not just money, but a philosophy. A way of moving through the world. And the more I read, the more I understood why Lionel had structured things the way he had. He hadn't left me the company in spite of my absence from the family business. He'd left it to me because of what I'd chosen to do instead. The next morning, I woke early, my body still on Asheville time. I showered, dressed in jeans and a cotton sweater, and drove back to the estate before I could talk myself out of it. The sun was just beginning to rise, the light soft and golden across the grounds. No one else was there. The house sat quiet and enormous, all those rooms waiting for purpose. I let myself in through the front door, my key still working despite everything. The house smelled different in the morning. Less like perfume and wine, more like wood and old paper, and the faint mustiness of rooms that didn't get opened often enough. I climbed the stairs to the third floor, to Lionel's study. I'd only been in there a handful of times as a child. It was his private space, the one room in the house that was truly his. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open slowly, half expecting him to be sitting at his desk, reading glasses perched on his nose, looking up with that slight smile that always made me feel seen. The room was empty, of course, but it still felt occupied, still held the imprint of his presence. The desk was mahogany, heavy and old, with carved details along the legs. The chair behind it was leather, worn smooth from decades of use. Bookshelves lined two walls, filled with everything from legal texts to poetry collections to field guides on southern birds. There was a window overlooking the back gardens, the glass wavy with age. And on the desk, in the center, was a wooden box. I recognized it immediately. I'd made it for him when I was 15, in a woodworking class at school. It was simple, unadorned, the joints slightly uneven because I hadn't yet mastered the technique. I'd given it to him for his birthday, embarrassed by how plain it was compared to the expensive gifts the rest of the family had bought. He'd held it in his hands, turning it over, examining the craftsmanship with the same attention he gave to multi-million-dollar contracts. "It's perfect," he'd said. "I'll keep my most important things in it." I'd assumed he was just being kind. I walked to the desk and lifted the lid. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. I pulled out the first one, unfolded it carefully. It was dated from 12 years ago, written in my own handwriting. A letter I'd sent him during my first year at college, talking about a painting I'd been working on, about a professor who'd encouraged me to think about art as conversation rather than product. I didn't remember sending it, but he'd kept it. I pulled out another. A postcard from Asheville, sent 6 years ago, with a picture of the Blue Ridge Mountains on the front. "Settled in. Finally feels like home. Thank you for believing this was possible. Nora." Beneath the letters were photographs. Me at various ages, most of them candid shots I didn't know existed. Me at 12, sitting in the garden with a sketchbook. Me at 16, laughing at something off camera. Me at 24, standing in front of the rehabilitation center on my first day of work, looking nervous and hopeful. There were newspaper clippings. Small articles about the center's programs, a few of them mentioning my name. An announcement about a community art show I'd organized 3 years ago. A letter to the editor from a veteran I'd worked with, praising the art therapy program, and specifically thanking me by name. Lionel had cut it out, saved it, filed it in this box alongside everything else he'd collected. At the bottom was a legal document. I unfolded it slowly. It was dated from 18 months ago, a transfer of shares, making me a silent partner in Bennett and Associates. I stared at the signature line, my name written in Lionel's careful script next to my actual signature. I didn't remember signing this. Then I did. 2 years ago, Lionel had sent me a packet of documents, said it was just routine estate planning, making sure everyone in the family had proper legal documentation for inheritance purposes. I'd signed without reading carefully, trusting him. He'd been preparing me all along, making me part of the company quietly, legally, so that when this moment came, I wouldn't be walking in cold. I'd already have standing, already have authority. I sat down in his chair, the box open in front of me, and let myself cry. Not from sadness, though there was plenty of that, but from the overwhelming weight of being known, of being seen so completely by someone who'd never asked me to perform for it. I stayed in the study for over an hour, reading through letters, looking at photographs, piecing together the evidence of his attention. When I finally left, I took the box with me. I locked the study door behind me and walked back downstairs, through the quiet house, out into the morning that had grown warm and bright. My phone rang as I reached my car. An unknown number, local area code. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Miss Bennett?" A woman's voice, professional and warm. "This is Catherine Morrison. I'm one of the senior project managers at Bennett and Associates. Ashford Green gave me your number. I hope this isn't too early to call." "It's fine," I said. "I was wondering if you might have time to come by the office this week. There are some things I think you'd want to see, and the staff would like to meet you. We've all been hoping you'd stop by. The Bennett and Associates offices were downtown in a renovated historic building on Broughton Street. I'd walked past it countless times as a teenager, never thinking I'd have any reason to go inside. The lobby was bright and modern, with exposed brick walls and large windows that let in natural light. There was a reception desk, a waiting area with comfortable chairs, and on one wall, a large photograph of a community garden project the company had helped develop in West Savannah. Catherine Morrison met me at the elevator. She was in her early 50s, I guessed, with short gray hair and glasses, dressed in slacks and a blazer. She shook my hand firmly, her smile genuine. "Thank you for coming. I know this must all be incredibly strange." "Strange is one word for it," I said. She laughed. "Fair enough. Come on up. I'll give you the tour." The offices occupied 3 floors. The second floor was mostly administrative, cubicles and conference rooms, the steady hum of people working. The third floor housed the executive offices and the design team, where architects and planners collaborated on projects. The fourth floor was Lionel's. His office, the boardroom, and a small library filled with architectural references and city planning documents. Catherine walked me through each floor, introducing me to people whose names I immediately forgot, too overwhelmed to retain anything. Everyone was kind. Everyone said some version of the same thing. "We're so glad you're here. Lionel spoke about you often. We've been looking forward to meeting you." On the fourth floor, Catherine showed me Lionel's office. It was larger than his study at the estate, but with the same feel. Organized, lived in, purposeful. There were blueprints spread across a large drafting table, a wall of filing cabinets, and a sitting area with 2 leather chairs facing a window that overlooked the street. "This is yours now," Catherine said. "Whenever you're ready." "I don't know if I'll ever be ready," I admitted. She smiled. "Lionel said you'd say something like that. He also said that was exactly why you were the right person." We sat in the leather chairs, and Catherine pulled out a folder. "I want to show you what we're working on right now. Current projects, things in development. I think it'll give you a sense of what the company does, day to day." She walked me through 6 active projects. A mixed-use development in Charleston that would include affordable housing units, retail space, and a community center. A renovation of an old textile mill in Columbia, converting it into artist studios and small business incubators. A partnership with the city of Savannah to revitalize a neglected neighborhood, focusing on infrastructure improvements and green spaces. Each project came with detailed plans, budgets, timelines, community impact assessments. Catherine explained the company's process, how they approached each project with community input, how they prioritized long-term sustainability over short-term profit. "This is how Lionel wanted things done," she said. "And it's how we'll continue to do them." She looked at me carefully. "The staff is worried that might change with new ownership." I shook my head. "It won't. I don't know much about commercial real estate, but I know about building things that matter. I know about listening to people and creating spaces where they can thrive. That's what I do in my work. It's what Lionel did in his." Catherine's expression softened. "Then you understand more than you think." Before I left, she handed me another folder. "This is for you to take. Background on the company, financial reports, organizational structure. And there's a letter in there from Lionel. He left it with me 6 months ago, told me to give it to you when you came to the office." I took the folder, feeling its weight. "Thank you for everything." Catherine walked me to the elevator. "We're here to help however you need. This doesn't have to be something you figure out alone." The elevator doors closed, and I stood there holding the folder, watching the numbers descend. When I got back to my hotel, I opened it immediately. Most of it was what Catherine had described, documents and reports, information I'd need to understand how the company operated. But at the bottom was the letter. 3 pages, handwritten, dated from 4 months before his death. "Nora," it began. "If you're reading this, then you've been to the office. You've met Catherine and probably some of the others. I hope they made you feel welcome. I hope you're beginning to see what I saw, that this work is not so different from what you've already been doing. I'm not going to tell you how to run this company. You're smart enough to figure that out, and you have good people around you who can help with what you don't know. But I want to tell you why I chose you, Because I suspect the rest of the family has spent considerable energy trying to convince you that you're unqualified. You are not unqualified. You are differently qualified, which is exactly what this company needs. Garrett understands profit margins, but not purpose. Celeste understands image but not impact. Your parents understand legacy in name only, not in practice. You, Nora, understand what it means to build something that serves others. You've spent years creating spaces where healing can happen, where people who've been broken can find ways to put themselves back together. That's what good development does too. It creates space for communities to heal, to grow, to become what they're meant to be. I'm not leaving you this company as a burden, though I know it will feel that way sometimes. I'm leaving it to you as an invitation. An invitation to take what you've learned in your small corner of the world and apply it to a larger canvas. You've always thought small was safer. You've made yourself small because the big spaces didn't have room for you. But the big spaces are where the real change happens. And I believe you're ready for them. The family will fight you. They'll try to make you feel like an imposter, like you stumbled into something you don't deserve. Don't listen. You earned this through every choice you made that they couldn't understand. Every time you chose integrity over approval, service over status, you were building the exact qualifications this role requires. I won't be there to see what you do with this. That's the hardest part of leaving, knowing I'll miss watching you become who you're meant to be. But I'm not worried. You've never needed an audience to do good work. You've always done it in the quiet spaces, where only the people it helps ever notice. Keep doing that. Just do it bigger now. The letter was signed with just his initial, a quick scrawl that I recognized from birthday cards, and those notes he used to leave tucked in unexpected places. I read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it back in the folder. I didn't cry this time. Instead, I felt something shift inside me, some piece of myself clicking into place. I'd spent so many years believing that being overlooked was the same as being worthless, that if my family couldn't see my value, it must not exist. But Lionel had seen it, had documented it, preserved it, built an entire plan around it. And now I had a choice. I could walk away, go back to Asheville, let the lawyers handle everything and live off the inheritance without ever engaging with the responsibility. Or I could step into the space he'd created for me, the space he believed I was ready for. I opened my laptop and sent an email to the center's director, letting her know I'd need to take a leave of absence. Family matters, I wrote. I'll be in touch about timeline. Then I emailed Catherine Morrison. I'd like to schedule a meeting with the full leadership team. I have questions, and I want to understand how decisions get made. Let me know when everyone's available. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. My phone rang almost immediately. It was Rachel. I answered. So she said without preamble, "Are you a billionaire now? Should I start calling you Miss Bennett?" "Please don't," I said. "But yes." Apparently. There was a pause. "How are you handling this?" "I don't know yet," I admitted. "I think I'm still in shock." "Are you coming back?" "I don't know that either. I think I need to stay here for a while. Figure out what this all means." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "You know you don't owe them anything, right? Your family. Just because someone left you something doesn't mean you have to become what they want you to be." "I know," I said. "But I don't think that's what Lionel wanted. I think he wanted me to become more of what I already am. Just on a bigger scale." "Then do that," Rachel said. "And call me when you need reminding." After we hung up, I sat on the hotel bed and looked around the generic room. I couldn't stay here. If I was going to do this, really do this, I needed to stop hiding in temporary spaces. I needed to claim the thing that had been left to me. Not just the company but the estate itself. The house that had never felt like home but was now legally mine. I packed my bag, checked out of the hotel, and drove back to the Bennett estate. This time I didn't park in the guest area. I pulled right up to the front, got out, and walked through the door like I had every right to be there. Because I did. The house was empty. No staff, no family members. Just rooms full of furniture and history and the accumulated weight of generations. I walked through it slowly, opening doors, looking into spaces I'd avoided as a child. The formal dining room where I'd sat at the far end of the table during holiday meals. The parlor where Victoria had hosted her ladies' auxiliary meetings. where I'd been told to stay quiet and out of sight. The conservatory where Celeste had practiced piano, where my attempts at the same had been dismissed as insufficiently talented. I climbed to the third floor and stood in the hallway outside Lionel's study. Then I walked past it to the room at the end of the hall. My old bedroom. I hadn't been inside it since I left for college. I turned the knob and pushed the door open. It looked frozen in time. The bed was still made with the same quilt, pale blue with white flowers. The bookshelf still held the same books, young adult novels and art history texts and poetry collections. The desk by the window still had my old lamp, the one with the stained glass shade I'd bought at a yard sale. And on the walls, faded rectangles where posters and paintings had once hung. I'd taken those with me when I left, rolled them carefully and packed them into my car. But the shadows remained, proof that I'd been here, that I'd tried to make this space mine. I set my bag down on the bed and walked to the window. From here you could see the back gardens, the old oak trees, the path that led down to the marsh. I used to sit here for hours, sketching, dreaming about being anywhere else. Now I was back, not as the girl who didn't fit, but as the woman who owned it all. I pulled out my phone and called Ashford Green. "I need to understand the full scope of everything," I said when he answered. "The company, the estate, the other properties. I need a complete briefing. And I need to know what decisions have to be made immediately versus what can wait." He didn't sound surprised. "I can set that up. When would you like to meet?" "Tomorrow," I said. "Early. And I want Catherine Morrison there too. Anyone else who's essential to understanding how things operate." "Consider it done," Ashford said. "And Nora, if I may, I think you're making the right choice." "I'm not sure I've made a choice yet," I said. "I'm just gathering information." "Sometimes," he said, "that's the same thing." After I hung up, I lay back on my old bed and stared at the ceiling. The house settled around me, creaks and sighs, the sounds of a place learning to accommodate a new presence. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the room. Tomorrow, I'd start learning how to be the person Lionel believed I could be. Tonight, I'd let myself be scared. The meeting with Ashford and Catherine started at 8 the following morning in the boardroom on the 4th floor of the Bennett & Associates building. I arrived 15 minutes early, wearing clothes I'd borrowed from my old closet at the estate, a blazer that still fit and slacks I hadn't worn in a decade. Catherine was already there, setting up a laptop and projector. She smiled when I walked in. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." I poured myself a cup and took a seat at the long table. The room had windows on two sides, light streaming in, and on the walls were framed photographs of completed projects. Buildings that had been transformed, neighborhoods that had been revitalized, communities that looked alive and purposeful. Ashford arrived exactly at 8, carrying 2 briefcases and a leather folio. He nodded at me, professional and composed, and took the seat across from mine. Over the next 3 hours, they walked me through everything. The company's structure, its current portfolio, its financial position, its outstanding contracts and obligations. Bennett & Associates employed 63 people across 4 offices in South Carolina and Georgia. It held equity positions in 22 active projects, had ongoing maintenance and management contracts for another 15 properties, and was in preliminary development discussions for 8 new ventures. The numbers were staggering. Annual revenue averaged $72 million. With operating costs around $45 million, leaving substantial profit that Lionel had traditionally reinvested into new projects or donated to community initiatives. The company had almost no debt, a rarity in commercial real estate, because Lionel had been conservative about leverage. He believed in building slowly, in making sure each project was financially sound before moving to the next. Catherine pulled up a spreadsheet showing the timeline for current projects. "This one in Charleston," she said, pointing to a mixed-use development, "is 18 months from completion. We're on schedule and under budget. The community response has been positive. We've already leased 70% of the commercial space, and the affordable housing units have a waiting list. This project in Columbia," she continued, clicking to the next slide, "is more complicated. We're dealing with environmental remediation because the textile mill had some contamination issues. It's taking longer and costing more than we initially projected, but it's the right thing to do, and we've been transparent with all stakeholders about the delays." Ashford took over, walking me through the legal structure. The company was privately held, with me now owning 82% of the shares. The remaining 18% was divided among 5 senior employees, including Catherine, as part of a profit-sharing arrangement Lionel had established years ago. This gives them stake in the company's success, Ashford explained, and it ensures continuity if something happens to majority ownership. It also means you're not making decisions in a vacuum. These people have expertise and investment in outcomes. I listened, took notes, asked questions when I didn't understand something. What's my role exactly? I asked. Am I expected to run day-to-day operations? Or is this more of an oversight position? That's largely up to you, Catherine said. Lionel was very hands-on, especially with major decisions. He trusted us to manage the details, but he wanted to be involved in strategic direction, community engagement, and any project that represented new territory for the company. You could operate the same way, or you could delegate more. We're equipped to handle either. I thought about that. Thought about the rehabilitation center, how I'd built that role from the ground up, how I'd learned to balance direct involvement with trusting my team. I don't want to pretend I know things I don't, I said. I'll need time to learn, and I'll need to rely on all of you for expertise. But I do want to be involved in decisions, especially anything that affects communities or represents the company's values. I'm not interested in being a silent owner who just collects checks. Catherine and Ashford exchanged a glance, something passing between them that looked like relief. That's what we hoped you'd say, Catherine admitted. There was concern, after the will reading, that the family might pressure you to sell or to install someone else as operational head. Someone who might not share Lionel's philosophy. I shook my head. That's not going to happen. Whatever else I figure out, I know I'm not handing this over to people who see it as just an asset to liquidate. We spent another hour going through immediate decisions that needed to be made. A bid on a property in Augusta that had to be submitted by the end of the week. A community meeting in Savannah about a proposed development that some residents were concerned about. A contract renewal with one of the company's architecture firms. For each item, Catherine or Ashford explained the context, the options, the implications. I asked questions, requested time to review documents, and made preliminary decisions on things that seemed straightforward. By the time we finished, it was past 11, and my head was spinning with information. Catherine closed her laptop. You did well. Most people would be overwhelmed by all of this. I am overwhelmed, I said. I'm just good at not showing it. She laughed. That's a useful skill in this business. Before they left, Ashford handed me a folder. This contains information about the estate itself. Property taxes, maintenance contracts, staff arrangements. Lionel employed a small team to manage the house and grounds. They've been on paid leave since his passing, waiting to hear about their status. You'll need to decide whether to keep them on, reduce staff, or make other arrangements. Another decision. Another responsibility. I took the folder and thanked them both. Catherine paused at the door. If you want company for that community meeting in Savannah, I'm happy to go with you. Introduce you. Help you navigate the dynamics. I'd appreciate that, I said. It's tomorrow night, she said. 7 o'clock at the East Side Community Center. I'll pick you up at 6:30. After they left, I sat alone in the boardroom, looking out at the Savannah skyline. Church steeples and live oaks, old buildings and new construction. A city caught between its past and its future. Not unlike me, I supposed. My phone buzzed. A text from Celeste. We need to talk. In person. I'm willing to meet you halfway on this. I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. There was no halfway. There was no negotiation. Lionel had made his decision, had structured everything to prevent exactly the kind of erosion Celeste was already attempting. I wasn't going to waste energy defending what was already legally settled. That evening, I returned to the estate and walked through the house with the staff folder open. There were 5 people on the payroll. Marcus, who managed the grounds and did general maintenance. Helen, who handled housekeeping and some cooking. James, who served as a combination driver and property supervisor. And 2 part-time staff who came in for deep cleaning and special events. I didn't know any of them well. They'd always been background figures during my childhood, People who moved through the house quietly, making sure everything functioned while remaining largely invisible to the family. I called Marcus first. He answered on the second ring, his voice cautious. Miss Bennett? Yes, I said. I wanted to talk to you about your position. There was a pause. I understand if you're making changes. I just hope you'll give me a reference. I was planning to let him know I wanted to keep everyone on, but something in his tone stopped me. Why would you need a reference? Well, he said, I figured with new ownership, you'd want your own people. That's usually how these things go. Have you worked here long? I asked. 22 years, he said. Started when your grandfather hired me to help renovate the garden structures. He kept me on after that. You do good work? Yes, ma'am, he said quietly. I do. Then your job is secure, I said. I'm not cleaning house. I'm just trying to understand how things operate. If you're willing to stay on, I'd like you to. The relief in his voice was audible. Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Thank you. I had similar conversations with Helen and James, both of whom had worked for the estate for over 15 years. Both seemed surprised that I was keeping them on, both grateful in a way that made me sad. They'd expected to be collateral damage in whatever family drama was unfolding. The fact that job security had been uncertain for them, through no fault of their own, felt like another small cruelty of the situation. By the time I finished the calls, it was nearly 8. I made myself a sandwich in the kitchen, feeling strange about being in that space alone, and carried it out to the back porch. The evening was warm, humidity hanging in the air, the sounds of cicadas and frogs creating that dense southern soundscape that never quite stops. I sat on the porch swing, the same one I used to read on as a teenager, and let myself feel the weight of everything that had happened in the past few days. A week ago, I'd been in Asheville, teaching art therapy, living in my small bungalow, existing in a life I'd carefully constructed to be manageable and mine. Now I was sitting on the porch of a mansion I owned, responsible for a company worth hundreds of millions, trying to figure out how to honor a legacy while staying true to myself. It felt impossible. It felt terrifying. But underneath the fear was something else. Not excitement exactly, but a kind of recognition. Like I'd been preparing for this without knowing it. Every veteran I'd worked with, every art project I'd facilitated, every time I'd helped someone find a way to express what words couldn't capture, I'd been learning how to see people, how to create space for healing, how to build something meaningful from raw materials and intention. That was what Lionel had seen. That was what he'd been documenting in that wooden box. Evidence that I knew how to do the thing he'd spent his life doing, just in a different context. The next evening, Catherine picked me up at 6:30 as promised. She drove us to the East Side neighborhood, an area I vaguely remembered from childhood as working class and largely black, a part of Savannah that didn't show up in tourist photographs. The community center was a low brick building with a parking lot that was already full. Inside, about 60 people were gathered in a meeting room, sitting in folding chairs arranged in rows facing a small stage with a podium and a projection screen. Catherine led me to seats near the front. People glanced at us, some curious, some wary. A woman in her 50s approached, extending her hand to Catherine. Good to see you again. And you must be Miss Bennett, she said, turning to me. I'm Dorothy Richardson. I coordinate community outreach for this neighborhood. Thank you for coming. Thank you for having me, I said. I understand there are concerns about the development project. Dorothy nodded. People are worried. We've seen development before, and it usually means displacement. Higher property taxes, long-time residents pushed out, businesses that don't serve the people who actually live here. We want to make sure that's not what's happening this time. The meeting started a few minutes later. A city planner presented an overview of the proposed project, a mixed-use development that would include new housing, a small grocery store, and renovated public spaces. It all sounded good on paper, but I could feel the skepticism in the room. When the presentation ended, Dorothy opened the floor for questions. An elderly man in the third row stood up. How much of that housing is going to be affordable? Because I've lived here 43 years, and I can't afford what they're building in other neighborhoods. Catherine stood. Of the 60 residential units, 24 are designated affordable housing, rent-controlled and prioritized for current neighborhood residents. Another 18 are workforce housing, Price for middle-income families. The remaining 18 are market rate, which helps subsidize the below-market units. A younger woman raised her hand. What about the businesses? Are you bringing in chains? Or is there space for local owners? We're prioritizing local businesses, Catherine said. The retail spaces will be offered first to existing neighborhood businesses that want to expand or relocate, with favorable lease terms for the first 5 years. A man near the back called out, "We've heard promises before. How do we know this is different?" That was when I stood up. I hadn't planned to speak, but something about his question, the exhaustion and distrust in his voice, pulled me to my feet. "My name is Nora Bennett," I said. "I recently inherited this company, and I'm still learning how all of this works. But I can tell you what I know about the man who built it. My grandfather believed that development should serve communities, not replace them. He believed that if a project displaced people or destroyed what made a neighborhood valuable, it was a failed project, no matter how profitable." I looked around the room. I've spent the last 8 years working in art therapy with veterans, helping people rebuild their lives after trauma. I know what it's like when systems fail people. I know what it's like when the people making decisions don't understand or care about the people those decisions affect. I can't promise I'll get everything right. I'm new to this, and I'm going to make mistakes. But I can promise that I'll listen, that I'll prioritize community voices, and that I won't move forward with any project that harms the people it's supposed to serve. The room was quiet. Then Dorothy spoke. "We appreciate you being here. Most developers don't bother showing up to these meetings. The fact that you're here, that says something." The meeting continued for another hour. People asked detailed questions about timelines, about environmental impact, about how the construction would affect traffic and noise. Catherine answered most of them, occasionally conferring with the city planner. I mostly listened, taking notes, watching the dynamics in the room. By the time we left, it was nearly 9. Catherine and I walked to her car in silence. "You did well in there," she said finally. "You didn't overpromise, and you didn't get defensive. That matters." I felt like I didn't know what I was talking about, I admitted. "You knew enough," she said. "And more importantly, you showed respect. That's what people need to see first. Everything else, you can learn." The next 2 weeks were a blur of learning. I met with the leadership team daily, shadowing Catherine as she managed projects, sitting in on calls with architects and city officials, reviewing budgets and contracts until the numbers started to make sense. I visited project sites, walked through buildings under construction, talked to contractors and community organizers. I read everything Lionel had written, notes and memos and strategic plans, trying to understand not just what he'd done but how he'd thought about it. At night, I'd return to the estate, exhausted and overwhelmed, and sit in his study, surrounded by the evidence of his life's work. Slowly, patterns emerged. I started to see how the pieces fit together, how a successful project required balancing financial viability with community benefit, how relationships mattered as much as contracts, how long-term thinking almost always produced better outcomes than short-term profit maximization. It was like learning a new language, one that shared vocabulary with the work I'd already been doing, but applied it to a different grammar. 3 weeks after the will reading, I received a formal letter from a law firm in Charleston. On behalf of Victoria, Philip, Garrett, and Celeste Bennett, we are writing to inform you of our client's intention to contest the will of Lionel Edward Bennett on the grounds of undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. We request that all asset transfers be frozen pending judicial review. I read the letter twice, then called Ashford. "They're doing it," I said. "They're contesting the will." He didn't sound surprised. "I expected this. The hidden clause still stands. If they proceed, they lose everything. Maybe they think they can win," I said. "Or maybe they're desperate enough not to care." "We'll respond formally," Ashford said. "But Nora, you should prepare yourself for this to get ugly. They're going to make accusations. They're going to try to paint you as manipulative or opportunistic. Don't let it destabilize you." I hung up and sat in the study, looking out at the gardens. Part of me wanted to call them, to try one more time to explain that I hadn't asked for this, hadn't schemed for it, had been as surprised as anyone. But I knew it wouldn't matter. They'd already decided on their narrative, and nothing I said would change it. The legal response went out the next day. A formal letter from Ashford's firm reminding the Bennett family of the hidden clause and the consequences of proceeding with their contest. It included documentation of Lionel's mental competency at the time the will was written, testimony from his doctors, and the notarized statements from the witnesses who'd been present during the will's execution. For 3 days, there was silence. Then one by one, they withdrew. First Garrett, then Celeste, then finally Victoria and Philip. No apologies, no acknowledgements. Just terse notifications from their lawyers that they were dropping the challenge. Ashford called to tell me, "It's over. They're not proceeding." I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt something closer to sadness. This was how it ended, not with reconciliation or understanding, but with a legal standoff that forced them to back down. We'd never be a family again. Maybe we never really had been. But now it was official, formalized in legal documents and severed inheritance. A month after the will reading, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror at the estate, getting ready for my first board meeting as majority owner of Bennett and Associates. I'd bought new clothes, professional pieces that fit the role I was stepping into. I'd had my hair cut, something sleek and manageable. I looked different than I had 5 weeks ago. More polished, more confident. Or maybe just better at pretending. The board meeting went smoothly. I'd prepared extensively, reviewed every project update, anticipated questions. The board members, a mix of business leaders and community advocates that Lionel had carefully selected over the years, seemed cautiously optimistic about my involvement. I presented a vision for the company's direction, emphasizing continuity with Lionel's values while acknowledging that I'd bring my own perspective, particularly around community engagement and social impact. One board member, an older man who'd known Lionel for decades, spoke up at the end. "Your grandfather always said that the measure of a company wasn't its profit margin but its purpose. I think he chose well." After the meeting, Catherine pulled me aside. "There's something I want to show you." We drove to West Savannah, to one of the company's completed projects from 5 years ago, a renovated community center that had been an abandoned warehouse. The building was beautiful, exposed brick and large windows, with spaces for after-school programs, adult education classes, and community gatherings. We walked through it, Catherine pointing out features, but what struck me most was how alive it felt. Kids doing homework in the tutoring room. Adults in a computer literacy class. A women's group meeting in one of the side rooms. "This is what Lionel built," Catherine said. "Not just buildings, but possibility. That's what you're inheriting." That evening, I returned to the estate and went up to my old bedroom. I'd been sleeping in the main guest suite, not ready to claim Lionel's room, not quite comfortable in my childhood space. But tonight, I walked in and looked around with different eyes. The faded rectangles on the walls where my art had hung. The desk where I'd done homework while dreaming of escape. The window where I'd sat and sketched and imagined being anywhere else. I pulled out my phone and called the rehabilitation center. When the director answered, I asked about bringing some of the veterans to Savannah, about starting a satellite art therapy program in partnership with Bennett and Associates community centers. Maybe in some of the neighborhoods where we're doing development work. She loved the idea. We talked for over an hour, sketching out possibilities, thinking about funding and logistics and how to make it work. After we hung up, I sat on the bed in my old room and realized something had shifted. I wasn't trying to choose between my old life and this new one. I was figuring out how to weave them together, how to bring what I'd learned in Asheville to what I was building in Savannah. This wasn't about becoming someone different. It was about becoming more fully myself, just with more resources and reach. I pulled out the letter Lionel had left me, the one that had been in the folder from Catherine. I read it again, slower this time, paying attention to different parts. You've always thought small was safer. You've made yourself small because the big spaces didn't have room for you. But the big spaces are where the real change happens. He'd been right. I'd spent years making myself smaller, convincing myself that working in one small center with one small group of people was enough. It was meaningful, it mattered, but I'd also been hiding, using my work as a shield against a world that had hurt me. Now I had the chance to do something bigger. Not because bigger was better, but because it could reach more people, could create more spaces for healing and growth and possibility. That was worth the fear. That was worth the risk of being visible again. 6 months after the will reading, I stood in the sunroom of the Bennett estate, the room where my childhood painting had been displayed and then removed. I'd had it renovated, turned it into a small gallery space, showcasing work from the art therapy programs I'd started in partnership with Bennett and Associates. Paintings and sculptures from veterans, from community members, from people finding their voices through creativity. There was an opening reception, small and intimate, just staff from the company, board members, and people from the neighborhoods where we were working. Dorothy Richardson came, bringing several of her neighbors. Marcus, Helen, and James were there too, no longer invisible background staff, but people I'd gotten to know, whose expertise I'd learned to value. Catherine gave a short speech about the intersection of development and community building. Then she introduced me. I stood in front of the assembled group, in the room where I'd once felt erased, and talked about what we were trying to build. Not just buildings and businesses, but spaces where people could become who they were meant to be, where healing was possible, where community meant something more than proximity. After the reception, I walked through the estate alone, room by room, seeing it not as the place that had rejected me but as the place I'd transformed. I kept some things the same, the bones and history of it. But I'd changed others, opened up spaces, brought in light, made it feel less like a museum and more like a home. In Lionel's study, I sat at his desk, the wooden box I'd made him still sitting in the center. I opened it and pulled out one of the early letters I'd sent him, the one from my first year of college. Reading it now, I could hear my younger self's uncertainty, the way I'd been trying to justify my choices, to explain why I'd chosen art over business, purpose over profit. He'd never needed the explanation. He'd understood all along. I pulled out a piece of his stationery and began to write, not to him exactly, but to the version of myself who'd sat in this estate as a child, feeling invisible and worthless. You were never the problem. You were just in the wrong room, expecting the wrong people to see you. But you were always visible to the ones who mattered. And one day, you'll own every room in this house. You'll fill them with work that matters and people who understand. You'll take the thing that hurt you and transform it into something that heals. Not just for you, but for others. That's what inheritance really means. Not what you receive, but what you do with it. I folded the letter and placed it in the box with all the others, a record of the journey from there to here. Then I closed the lid and stood, looking out the window at the gardens that Marcus had been tending for over 2 decades, at the oak trees that had stood witness to generations of Bennetts, at the city beyond that was slowly learning my name not as the overlooked granddaughter, but as the woman building. Something worth noticing. Tomorrow I had another community meeting, another project to review, another decision to make about how to balance profit and purpose, growth and preservation, legacy and innovation. But tonight, I let myself feel what I'd been too afraid to feel for weeks. Not triumph, because this wasn't about winning, but something quieter and deeper. Belonging. Not to a family that had never made room for me, but to the work itself. To the purpose Lionel had spent his life serving, and had trusted me to carry forward. I turned off the light in the study and walked downstairs, through the house that was finally, truly mine. Not because a will had said so, but because I'd claimed it. Because I'd proven, to myself more than anyone, that I could hold something this big without letting it crush me, without losing the parts of myself that mattered most. The parts Lionel had seen and valued when no one else had bothered to look. The seasons changed, and Savannah transformed around me in ways both subtle and profound. The oppressive heat of September gave way to the milder temperatures of autumn, and with it came a rhythm I was beginning to understand. Monday mornings meant leadership meetings at the Bennett and Associates offices, where Catherine and I would review project timelines and discuss community feedback. Wednesdays I reserved for site visits, walking through developments in progress, talking to contractors and neighbors, making sure the vision on paper translated to reality on the ground. Fridays were for the art therapy programs, the part of the work that still felt most like home, where I could sit with veterans and community members, and help them find expression through color and form. The estate had slowly transformed too. I'd hired back all the staff full-time, and increased their salaries to match what Lionel should have been paying all along. Marcus had helped me convert the old greenhouse into a proper studio space, with north-facing windows and storage for supplies. Helen had begun preparing meals again. Not the formal affairs the family used to demand, but simple dinners that we often ate together in the kitchen. The four of us. Sometimes five when Catherine stayed late to work on proposals. The house felt lived in for the first time in my memory, less like a showplace and more like a space where actual life happened. I'd opened up rooms that had been closed for years, brought in furniture that was comfortable rather than just impressive, hung art from the therapy programs on walls that had only ever displayed expensive, but soulless pieces chosen by decorators. In late October, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read simply, "From an old friend of Lionel's." I almost deleted it, assuming it was another attempt by some distant relative or opportunistic acquaintance to establish a connection now that I controlled the fortune. But something made me open it. The message was brief. "Miss Bennet, my name is Richard Castellano. I was a colleague of your grandfather's for many years, though we lost touch in his final decade. I've recently learned of his passing and of the extraordinary decision he made regarding his estate. I wonder if you might have time to meet. There are some things about Lionel's earlier years that I think would interest you, projects and principles that shaped everything he built. I'm in Savannah next week and would be honored to buy you coffee." The email felt genuine in a way that the others hadn't, lacking the performative grief or thinly veiled requests that usually accompanied such messages. I responded, suggesting we meet at a cafe downtown, neutral territory where I could leave easily if needed. Richard Castellano turned out to be a man in his late 70s, with white hair, and the kind of weathered face that suggested a life spent outdoors. He was waiting at a corner table when I arrived, standing politely when he saw me approach. "Miss Bennet, thank you for agreeing to meet." He had a slight accent, something Mediterranean that softened his consonants. "Please call me Nora," I said, shaking his hand. We sat, and he pulled out a worn leather portfolio, the kind that had clearly traveled extensively. "I brought some things I thought you should see," he said. "Your grandfather and I worked together in the early days back when Bennett and Associates was just him and a borrowed truck. This was before he became the man everyone knows, before the reputation and the empire." We ordered coffee, and Richard began to lay out photographs on the table. Black and white images from what looked like the 1970s. Young men in work clothes standing in front of half-built structures. Community gatherings in empty lots. Lionel, maybe 40 years old, shaking hands with an elderly black woman in front of a small house. "This was the West Side Project," Richard said, pointing to one photo. 1976. The city wanted to demolish this entire neighborhood, said it was blighted beyond saving. Lionel spent 2 years fighting them, not with lawyers at first, but with hammers and nails. We renovated 43 houses with volunteer labor and donated materials. Proved the neighborhood was worth saving. I studied the photograph of young Lionel, seeing something in his expression that I recognized. A kind of determined optimism that refused to accept the easy narrative. "Why didn't I know about this?" I asked. "It's not in any of the company histories I've read." Richard smiled. "Your grandfather didn't like to talk about it. Said it felt like bragging. But it was the foundation of everything. That project taught him that development wasn't about building new things, it was about seeing value where others saw problems." He leaned back in his chair. "I'm telling you this because I've been watching what you've been doing these past months. The community programs, the art therapy integration, the way you've been approaching development in the East Side neighborhood. It's exactly what Lionel would have done, maybe even better because you're bringing something to it he didn't have." "What's that?" I asked. "Personal experience of being overlooked," Richard said bluntly. Lionel understood marginalized communities intellectually. He had empathy and principle. But you've lived it. You know what it feels like to be invisible in spaces that should see you. That makes your work more authentic. We talked for over 2 hours. Richard shared stories I'd never heard, filling in gaps in Lionel's history that the official records had smoothed over. The fights with city councils, the projects that had failed before the successful ones. The times Lionel had lost money because he refused to compromise on quality or community benefit. He was stubborn, Richard said, smiling at the memory. Once he decided something was right, you couldn't move him. Even when it cost him. Especially when it cost him. Before we parted, Richard handed me the portfolio. These are for you. Copies of everything. I thought you should have the full picture of what you're continuing. I took the portfolio carefully, feeling its weight. Thank you for this. For helping me understand him better. Richard stood, preparing to leave. He was proud of you, you know. In those last years, when we'd occasionally exchange emails, he'd mention you. Never the others, just you. Said you were the only one who understood what mattered. After Richard left, I sat in the cafe for a long time, going through the photographs and documents. Letters Lionel had written to city officials, arguing for community preservation. Budgets from early projects showing how he'd structured deals to prioritize affordability over profit. Testimonials from residents whose lives had been changed by his refusal to give up on their neighborhoods. This was the inheritance that mattered more than the money. This was the proof that the work I was trying to do wasn't new, wasn't my invention, but a continuation of something Lionel had started half a century ago. I'd been worried about honoring his legacy, anxious that I might somehow diminish it or take it in the wrong direction. But seeing these early projects, understanding the struggles and the principles, I realized I wasn't diminishing anything. I was amplifying it, bringing it forward into a new generation with new tools and new understanding. That evening, I called a special meeting of the leadership team. I want to start something new, I told them when we gathered in the boardroom. An initiative specifically focused on preservation and revitalization in neighborhoods facing displacement pressure. I want us to partner with residents, not just consult them. Give them actual ownership stake in the projects, decision-making power, profit sharing. Catherine leaned forward, interested. That's a significant departure from traditional development models. It is, I acknowledged. But it's not a departure from what Lionel believed. I shared some of what Richard had told me, showed them the photographs from the West Side project. This is what the company was built on. Somewhere along the way, as it grew and professionalized, we may have lost some of that original vision. I want to bring it back. We spent 3 hours that night sketching out what it might look like. A community ownership model where residents would hold equity positions in developments in their neighborhoods. A profit-sharing structure that ensured long-term benefits stayed local. A design process that centered resident voices from the very beginning, not as an afterthought but as the foundation. It was ambitious, probably idealistic, and definitely risky. But everyone in that room was engaged, excited even, contributing ideas and solving problems in real time. By the time we finished, we had the framework for something that could genuinely change how development happened in Savannah and beyond. 2 weeks later, we presented the initiative at a community meeting in the East Side neighborhood, the same place where I'd first spoken months ago. The room was packed, even more crowded than before. Dorothy Richardson introduced me with words that felt both humbling and terrifying. Miss Bennett has been showing up, not just to meetings but to the neighborhood. She's been listening. Tonight, she has something to share that I think you'll want to hear. I stood at the podium, looking out at faces that were beginning to feel familiar. Some skeptical still, some cautiously hopeful, all of them tired of promises that never materialized. We've been working on a new model for the development project, I began. One that gives you, the residents of this neighborhood, actual ownership and decision-making power. Not just consultation, but real stake in the outcomes. I explained the structure we'd developed. How residents would be offered equity positions at no upfront cost, how profits would be shared, how design decisions would require community approval, how we'd establish a neighborhood board with the power to veto elements of the project that didn't serve community interests. The room was quiet as I spoke, people processing what felt too good to be true because it usually was. When I finished, an elderly woman in the front row raised her hand. I've lived through urban renewal, through gentrification, through every kind of development promise there is. They all sound good at the start. How is this different? It's different because the structure ensures you have power, not just our goodwill, I said. The legal agreements give you enforceable rights. You're not trusting us to do the right thing. You're holding documents that require us to. A younger man stood up. What do you get out of this? If you're sharing profits and giving up control, why do it? Because the measure of success isn't how much money we make, I said. It's whether the neighborhood is better off in 10 years, whether families can still afford to live here, whether the businesses reflect the community's character. If we do this right, everyone benefits. If we just extract value and move on, we've failed, even if the profit margin looks good. Dorothy stood then, and the room's attention shifted to her. I've been in a lot of these meetings, she said. I've heard a lot of developers say the right things. But I've also been watching Miss Bennett for months now. She's been here when there were no cameras, no press. She's been learning, asking questions, showing up to neighborhood events. I'm not saying we should accept this blindly, but I am saying we should take it seriously. The conversation continued for another hour, residents asking detailed questions about timelines, about legal protections, about what happened if the company was sold or if I left. Catherine and I answered everything we could, acknowledged what we didn't know yet, committed to working through the details with community input. By the end of the meeting, there was cautious agreement to move forward with a pilot phase, a smaller piece of the development that would test the model before applying it to the full project. As people filed out, several stopped to shake my hand or say thank you for trying something different. Dorothy pulled me aside near the door. This is the right thing, she said. But you know it's going to be complicated. Community ownership sounds beautiful, but people disagree. There will be conflicts, slow decision-making, frustration on all sides. I know, I said. But I'd rather deal with the complications of genuine partnership than the efficiency of excluding people from their own futures. She smiled. Lionel would have said something like that. The holidays approached, and with them came the question I'd been avoiding. What to do about family? I hadn't spoken to any of them since the legal challenge had been withdrawn. No calls, no texts, no attempts at contact from either side. The silence had been a relief at first, a respite from the tension and manipulation. But as Thanksgiving neared, I felt the absence more acutely. Not because I missed them exactly, but because the shape of family, even a broken one, still left an outline when it was gone. Helen asked me one morning, as we shared coffee in the kitchen, whether I'd be hosting Thanksgiving at the estate. The family used to gather here every year, she said carefully. I wasn't sure if you'd want to continue that tradition. I don't think they'd come if I invited them, I said. And I'm not sure I want them to. She nodded, understanding. What about your own people? The ones you've built your life with? That gave me an idea. Instead of the traditional Bennett Thanksgiving, exclusive and performative, I organized something different. I invited the staff, Catherine and her family, Dorothy and several people from the Eastside community, some of the veterans from the art therapy program, Richard Castellano, who was still in town. People who'd become part of my life in these transformative months. We set up tables in the dining room that had once hosted formal dinners where I'd sat at the far end, barely visible. Now it was crowded and loud, multiple conversations happening at once, children running between rooms, laughter echoing off the high ceilings. Marcus brought his famous cornbread dressing. Helen prepared a turkey with the same care she'd given to countless Bennett gatherings, but this time she sat at the table with us instead of serving from the kitchen. Catherine's husband told stories about their early years together, when they'd had nothing but optimism and student debt. One of the veterans, a man named Carl who'd been working with clay in the art program, brought a set of handmade bowls for the table, each one unique and slightly imperfect and beautiful. As we ate, people shared what they were grateful for. Dorothy talked about the community initiative, about feeling hope for her neighborhood's future for the first time in years. Richard spoke about witnessing the continuation of work he'd helped start 50 years ago. Carl said simply, I'm grateful for places that let you build yourself back. When it was my turn, I looked around the table at these people who'd become my community, my chosen family. A year ago, I was in Asheville, living a small life that felt safe, I said. I thought I'd found peace by building something I could control, something that couldn't hurt me because I kept it contained. Then I inherited this. I gestured at the house around us, and I was terrified. Terrified of the responsibility, of being visible again, of failing to honor what Lionel had built. But what I've learned is that peace isn't about staying small. It's about being big enough to hold complexity. Joy and grief, success and failure, connection and loss. All of it together. I paused, feeling emotion rise in my throat. So I'm grateful for all of you. For teaching me that family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about showing up for each other, about building something together that's bigger than what any of us could do alone. The room was quiet for a moment, then someone started clapping, and others joined in, and I felt seen in a way I never had at any Bennett family gathering. Later that night, after everyone had left and the house was quiet again, I sat in Lionel's study with a glass of wine. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I opened it. It was from Celeste. The message was short. I saw the article about your Thanksgiving gathering. The community development model. It all sounds very noble. I hope you know what you're doing. There was no warmth in it, no real attempt at connection. Just a reminder that they were watching, judging, waiting perhaps for me to fail. I stared at the message for a long time, considering whether to respond. Finally, I typed, I don't know what I'm doing half the time, but I'm learning, and I'm trying to do right by the people this work affects. That's more than I can say for how things were before. I hit send before I could second guess myself. She didn't respond, and I didn't expect her to. That exchange, brief and unsatisfying as it was, felt like a kind of closure. Not reconciliation, but acknowledgement. We existed in the same world, had shared a past, but we were building very different futures. And I was at peace with that. As December arrived, the East Side pilot project broke ground. We held a ceremony in the neighborhood, simple and community-focused. Residents who'd be part of the ownership structure turned the first shovels of dirt alongside the construction crew. Dorothy spoke about what this meant for longtime residents, about the difference between development that serves people and development that displaces them. I kept my remarks brief, focusing on partnership and shared vision rather than on myself. But afterward, as I stood watching children play on the construction site, carefully supervised by parents and workers, I felt something settle in my chest. This was real. This was happening. And it was happening because Lionel had seen something in me that I hadn't seen in myself, had trusted me with resources and responsibility that could make a genuine difference. A week before Christmas, I received a package at the office. No return address, but the handwriting on the label was vaguely familiar. I opened it carefully. Inside was a painting, small, unframed. I recognized it immediately. It was the watercolor I'd done for the Bennett Foundation Gala when I was 12, the one that had been relegated to the back corner, and then thrown away with a wine stain. But this version was pristine, no stain, carefully preserved. At the bottom was a note in handwriting I didn't recognize. Miss Bennett, I was on the catering staff at the gala that night. I saw what happened to your painting, saw them discard it. I couldn't let that happen. I took it home, cleaned it as best I could, and kept it. I've been following your work with the company, and I think you should have this back. It deserves to be seen. You always deserve to be seen. The note was signed simply Marie. I held the painting carefully, looking at the brushstrokes I'd made as a 12-year-old girl trying so hard to matter. The colors were faded slightly, the paper showed its age, but it was whole. Someone I'd never known had seen my worth when my own family couldn't. Had preserved something I'd created when I had no power to preserve it myself. I hung it in my office, right behind my desk where I'd see it every day. A reminder of where I'd started, of the girl who'd kept creating even when no one applauded, who'd kept showing up even when there was no seat at the table. That girl had grown into someone who could build tables big enough for everyone. On Christmas Eve, I drove out to Bonaventure Cemetery where Lionel was buried. The cemetery was beautiful in a melancholy way. Ancient oaks draped with Spanish moss, weathered gravestones telling stories of lives long finished. I found his grave easily, the stone simple despite the family's tendency toward ostentation. Lionel Edward Bennett, it read. Builder of communities, believer in people. I sat on the bench nearby and talked to him the way I used to when he was alive, telling him about the projects, about the community ownership model, about Thanksgiving with people who'd become family. I told him about the painting, about Marie's kindness, about how the small acts of witness and care had sustained me through years of feeling invisible. I wish you were here to see this, I said finally, to see what's becoming of the thing you built. But I think you already saw it. I think that's why you trusted me with it. The wind moved through the oak trees, and somewhere nearby a bird called out, clear and insistent. I stood, touched the gravestone once, and walked back to my car. That night, alone in the estate, I made a decision. I called Catherine. I know it's Christmas Eve, I said when she answered. But I need to run something by you. She laughed. When has timing ever stopped you? What's on your mind? I want to establish a foundation, I said. Separate from the company but funded by a percentage of its profits. Focused on community ownership models, art therapy programs, preservation of neighborhoods facing displacement. I want to make this bigger than just our projects in Savannah. There was a pause, then Catherine's voice came back warm and excited. That's brilliant. That's exactly the kind of scaling that makes lasting change. We can structure it as a nonprofit, get it going by spring. We talked for an hour, sketching out possibilities, thinking through structure and mission. By the time we hung up, the foundation had a working name. The Lionel Bennett Community Building Initiative. Not the Bennett Family Foundation. Not something that centered me or the company, but something that honored his vision and made it accessible beyond the limits of our direct work. I spent Christmas Day working on the proposal, outlining programs and principles, thinking about how to operationalize the values Lionel had lived. It felt right, spending the holiday this way, building rather than performing family obligation. On New Year's Eve, I stood on the porch of the estate watching fireworks over the Savannah River in the distance. My phone rang, Rachel calling from Asheville. Happy New Year, she said when I answered. How's the reluctant heiress doing? I laughed. Less reluctant than I used to be. She was quiet for a moment. You sound different. Settled, maybe. More like yourself. I feel different, I admitted. I think I finally figured out that being myself doesn't mean staying small. It means taking up the space I need to do the work that matters. That's growth, Rachel said. I'm proud of you. We talked for a while longer, and she told me about the center in Asheville, about the programs continuing in my absence, about how they'd hired someone new to take over some of my responsibilities. It should have hurt, knowing I'd been replaced. But instead, I felt satisfaction. The work was continuing, growing beyond my direct involvement. That was success, not failure. After we hung up, I stayed on the porch, watching the last of the fireworks fade. The new year stretched ahead, full of possibility and challenge. The East Side project would continue. The foundation would launch. New developments would begin. There would be complications, conflicts, moments when I'd question whether I was capable of this. But I wasn't the same person who'd sat in that library 6 months ago. Invisible and uncertain. I'd learned to hold space for complexity, to lead with values rather than just expertise, to build partnerships instead of hierarchies. I'd learned that inheritance wasn't just what you received, but what you chose to do with it. How you transformed pain into purpose, rejection into resilience, invisibility into impact. As midnight approached, I raised my wine glass to the Savannah sky, to Lionel who'd seen me when no one else had, to the community I'd found and built, to the woman I was becoming. To new beginnings, I whispered. To building something that lasts. The clock struck 12, and in the distance, church bells rang out across the city. The new year had begun, and I was ready for it. Ready to continue the work, to honor the legacy, to create spaces where others could be seen the way I finally, fully was. The Bennett estate stood behind me, no longer a place of rejection, but a foundation for building forward. And I stood in front of it, no longer the invisible girl, but the woman who'd learned to claim her place, her power, her purpose. Not because someone had given it to me, but because I'd proven, to myself more than anyone, that I was worthy of holding it. The fireworks ended, the night grew quiet, and I walked back inside to the home that was finally, truly mine. Not just in legal documents, but in the life I was building within its walls, in the work I was doing in its name, in the future I was creating from the foundation of everything that had come before. This was inheritance. This was legacy. This was what it meant to be seen, to see yourself clearly, and to build something worthy of both. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.